Alright, so I've made a lot of videos discussing my thoughts on gender, what it is, what it isn't, and especially all of the narrative trappings surrounding the trans community. But I haven't really said what I think gender is. Maybe I did like 3 years ago, but those opinions oftentimes don't align with what I currently think. So I'm going to try to nail down what I believe gender is now. To put it in one sentence, gender is subjective, meaning that not only is it subjective to you in terms of how you see yourself, it is also subjective to me in terms of how I see you. So all of us have an intuitive response to the affectations that you present, whether they are feminine, whether they are masculine, or reside somewhere in the middle on the spectrum. It's possible to be on the feminine side of the masculine spectrum and still ultimately viewed as masculine enough to pass as male. So of course there exist deviations and variations. It's a sliding scale, it's a spectrum. But ultimately, the spectrum is defined by the existence of feminine affectations and masculine affectations. And the confluence of traits that make up this gender, the social recognition of this gender, are that. They're feminine and masculine. It's the confluence of these traits. And so, of course, like with any category that is going to be based on societal norms, going to be based on subjectivity, going to be based on these kind of like airy perceptions of one another, they're of course going to be subject to an individual's perception. So we may all be basically seeing the same thing, but we're going to be seeing it in different ways, thereby applying it differently to different people. So there are people who I've met who others intuitively saw as male, for example, that I intuitively saw as female, simply because our individual conditioning, the way that we respond to the confluence of traits that they were presenting and the way that they were presenting them was different. Our perception of those things was different, even though we were seeing the same thing. And so, because gender is not objective the way that biological sex is objective, because it is so subject to the personal feelings of the other or to of ourselves. The fact that like people can identify as certain genders where you can't really identify as having another sex. That's not how it works. I think it opens the door to not just you being able to perceive yourself in a particular way, but others being able to perceive you in a particular way as well. So if there is someone who identifies as, for example, a trans man, and I see them putting almost no effort into their appearance, I'm going to intuitively see them as female. Now, of course, that does not mean I'm not going to refer to them as he, him. That would be impolite of me to do, but I am going to see them as female. I mean, that's just a reality. That is the honest reality. And if that hurts for you to hear, I'm sorry, but maybe you need to have a thicker skin when it comes to these things, because there is a whole world out there that disagrees with you. And if you want people like us to disagree with you a little less, maybe you should put some more fucking effort into your appearance. And I understand that biology is a cruel thing, and I understand that it must feel absolutely horrible to be inside of your body at all times and to be putting in all this effort at times and not get the results that you want to get out of it. I understand that that's awful because I had transitioned at one point in the past and found myself to be absolutely miserable with the results and completely dysphoric as a result of identifying as a gender that I fundamentally was not. And so I understand what it's like to feel dysphoric with oneself and one's gender. That's an experience that I have literally had, although through more roundabout means, whereas you've just experienced this your whole life. The equipment you were assigned with did not match the build. It wasn't right for the job at hand, and that's awful, right? Um, and so it's not like I don't feel for these people, and it's not even like I would say these things to these people's face unless the circumstance absolutely called for it, unless I felt as though me telling them this, albeit in less harsh terms, was necessary for their growth, development, happiness, etc. But I'm not gonna just go out and like unprompted say this stuff to people. If people wish to be referred to a certain way, I will do my damnedest to refer to them that way, and I'll even try to change the way that I see them. Because even though I believe gender to be subjective and thereby up to our individual perceptions, our intuitions are as they are, I also believe that those intuitions can change. And I believe this because being someone who's grown up on the internet and around a lot of trans people, I've seen my own intuitions about what gender is change. I have intuitively come to see certain people who identify with a gender that is not what they were born with. I've seen the way I perceive them change to be more in line with what they say that they are, who they really are. And so I don't think it's impossible for me to do this again or me to do this in like a different way. I think it's ultimately up to the circumstances and the person and the way that I change as society changes. And I think this is the case with everybody. Ultimately, I'm a gender abolitionist. I believe that gender as an institution is inherently oppressive and that it's forcing us to conform to all of these gender stereotypes and societal expectations that are ultimately toxic to not just women, but also men. And gender stereotypes are something that, we as feminists have been trying to dismantle like forever. And ultimately, the only way that I think that we can tear down these oppressive institutions is by broadening out the categories of gender to be as broad as humanly possible until they no longer mean anything. So you know how I mentioned that I have this intuitive reaction to certain affectations, whether they be feminine or masculine, and that will ultimately inform me on whether or not I am to view you as male or female? What if those affectations got broader? What if we considered an even broader amount of things to be feminine or masculine? And as time went on, it got broader and broader and broader until it was impossible for me to differentiate between the two. I think that would be a world where gender would cease to exist, because if everyone is female, then no one is. If everyone is male, then no one is. And that's the world that I want to see. I want to see a world where this stuff ceases to be important, because philosophically, I already recognize it to be not important. It does not fucking matter. But it matters a lot to certain people. It matters a lot to certain people because a strict form of gender norms and of gender stereotypes are imposed on us socially from the moment that we are born to the moment that we reach adulthood, and then onward from there, we are subjected to these strict views of gender and oftentimes forced to adhere to those strict views of gender. And the stereotypes of what a man or woman should do or should be are everywhere. They're everywhere, down to the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the movies that we see, the things that we think, the language that we use. Gender and gender norms, gender roles affect all of these things. And in that sense, it is literally an outside force imposing its will on you. It is a vehicle by which society can impose its will on you. And that is ultimately an oppressive institution in my own view. So what do we do about it? We recognize transgender people as being the gender that they claim to be, and as time goes on, as new generations are born with this group of people visible in our society, the more of those kids are gonna grow up to ultimately see those people exactly as what they say that they are. Those people are going to be seen as female or male by this whole generation of kids, even when they're not doing that good of a job at their transition. That's the future that I want to see, because the longer that process takes to play out, and the more extreme it becomes ultimately, that's going to be a world where gender ceases to exist. At the end of it all, it's going to cease to exist. And that's what I want to see. I want to see that because it's not just good for trans people. It's good for people like me too. You know, I'm a male. I've got a lot of male things about me, but I've got a lot of things about me that also aren't very male. You know, I don't adhere to gender stereotypes for the most part. I hate gender stereotypes. And moreover, I often simply do not understand them. I don't understand why this thing is male or that thing is female. My whole life I found these things to be completely and utterly arbitrary, and yet they continue to be imposed on me by society. And so, if trans people and the widespread societal acceptance of them for generations to come can be used as a vehicle to abolish gender as a whole, to make it just stop fucking mattering in our lives, please sign me up. I will do whatever I can to advance that kind of world. And, you know, like I said, you know, this is kind of a self-interested way of talking about it, but it's also really good for those trans people. And their lives matter, their feelings matter, their role in society matters. And so I think it's just kind of good for everybody if we left this whole gender thing behind. It's kind of retarded that we've allowed for it to be as influential in our lives as it is. Let's do away with it. Let's just burn it all down. Get rid of it. That's what I want to see. And yeah, I mean that's my roundabout way of saying gender is subjective, but also let's make it so broad that it ceases to mean any fucking thing, and then we stop using this subjective category altogether.